March 15th, 1943, RAF Marham, Norfolk, England. Flight Sergeant Eddie Howe crouched beside the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine of Mosquito DZAth 367, his hands black with oil, his career about to end. The modification he'd just completed violated every regulation in the Air Ministry Technical Manual. The chief engineer had explicitly forbidden it. Even the squadron leader had warned him to stop tinkering with perfectly good engines. But Eddie Howe wasn't thinking about regulations. He was thinking about the 6 Mosquito crews who hadn't come home from Berlin last month, shot down by Focke-Wulf 190s that were somehow catching aircraft that weren't supposed to be catchable. The wooden wonder they called the Mosquito, the fastest operational aircraft in the RAF. Except it wasn't fast enough anymore. Howe tightened the final bolt on his unauthorized modification and stepped back. The Lancaster bomber crews called him the Mad Mechanic. His own squadron called him worse things. But tomorrow morning, when Wing Commander Peter Shand took DZ-367 up for what everyone assumed would be a standard test flight, they would discover something extraordinary. Howe had made the Mosquito faster than any German fighter in existence. He'd done it by ignoring everything Rolls-Royce had told him about how their engines should work. What nobody knew yet was that Howe's forbidden tuning method would transform the Mosquito from merely fast into genuinely untouchable. Within 6 months, his modifications would be quietly copied across every Mosquito squadron in Bomber Command. The Germans would spend the rest of the war trying to figure out how British wooden aircraft were outrunning their best fighters. And the Air Ministry would never officially acknowledge that a flight sergeant from Birmingham had revolutionized their entire light bomber force by breaking every rule they'd written. The story of how one mechanic's unauthorized genius turned the Mosquito into the war's most feared aircraft begins not with heroic pilots or brilliant designers, but with a stubborn man who refused to accept that good enough was good enough. The de Havilland Mosquito had entered service in late 1941 as a revelation, built almost entirely from wood by furniture makers and piano manufacturers. It could outrun every fighter the Luftwaffe possessed. The original specification promised 400 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. Early production models actually delivered 410. Pilots loved it. The Air Ministry considered it a miracle. By early 1943, the miracle was dying. German fighters were catching Mosquitoes. Not often, but often enough. On the night of February 16th, 3 Mosquitoes from 105 Squadron were shot down over Berlin. All 3 crews were experienced. All 3 aircraft were maintaining maximum cruise speed. All 3 were caught by Focke-Wulf 190s that shouldn't have been able to catch them. Wing Commander Peter Shand knew something was wrong. He'd been flying Mosquitoes since they'd entered service. He knew exactly how fast his aircraft should be going. And lately, they weren't going fast enough. At 28,000 feet over Hamburg, he'd watched a Focke-Wulf slowly gaining on him. Slowly, but gaining. That wasn't supposed to happen. The official reports blamed pilot error or mechanical problems. The Air Ministry insisted the Mosquito's performance specifications remained unchanged. Rolls-Royce representatives visited Marham and pronounced the engines perfect. But the crews knew better. They were dying because their speed advantage had evaporated. Eddie Howe had been maintaining Mosquito engines since the aircraft arrived at Marham in 1942. The 34-year-old flight sergeant had worked on Merlin engines since before the war, first as a civilian mechanic at a Rolls-Royce service center in Birmingham, then in the RAF after he enlisted in 1940. He understood these engines better than most engineers who designed them, and Howe had noticed something the technical manuals never mentioned. The Merlin engines in the Mosquitoes weren't performing to specification, not because they were broken, but because they were being operated exactly as Rolls-Royce instructed. The conservative fuel mixture settings, the careful throttle limitations, the precise boost pressure restrictions, all of it was designed to make the engines reliable and long-lasting. But Howe didn't care about engine longevity. He cared about keeping crews alive. And keeping crews alive meant going faster than the Germans. Everything else was secondary. In January 1943, Howe began experimenting. Not officially, not with permission, just quiet adjustments to a handful of aircraft, testing his theories during routine maintenance periods. He enriched the fuel mixture beyond recommended settings. He advanced the ignition timing past factory specifications. He increased boost pressure to levels that made Rolls-Royce engineers wince when they eventually found out. The results were immediate and dramatic. Mosquitoes with Howe's modifications gained 15 to 20 miles per hour in top speed. More importantly, they gained that speed at high altitude where the German fighters operated, but the modifications violated every technical directive the Air Ministry had issued. Rolls-Royce would have been horrified. The engines weren't supposed to run like that. Howe didn't care. He'd found a way to make Mosquitoes faster. If the brass didn't like it, they could court-martial him after the war. Right now, crews were dying because their aircraft weren't fast enough. He had a solution. He was going to use it. The chief engineer at Marham, Flight Lieutenant George Palmer, discovered what Howe was doing in late February. Palmer was furious. He ordered Howe to restore all modified engines to factory specifications immediately. Such modifications were unauthorized, dangerous, and against regulations. If an engine failed because of Howe's tinkering, the entire squadron could be grounded. Howe refused. Quietly, politely, but absolutely. He would continue making the modifications. If Palmer wanted to stop him, Palmer could bring charges. But until then, Howe was going to keep making Mosquitoes faster. Palmer threatened everything short of immediate arrest. Howe kept working. By early March, every Mosquito in 105 Squadron had received Howe's unauthorized tuning, and the pilots were starting to notice. March 17, 1943. Wing Commander Shand climbed into DZ-37 for a routine test flight, unaware that Eddie Howe had spent the previous night modifying both Merlin engines beyond anything Rolls-Royce would have approved. His flight engineer, Sergeant Bill Morris, noticed the fuel mixture gauges were reading differently than normal, but said nothing. Ground crew didn't question flight sergeants like Howe. Shand opened the throttles and felt the Mosquito surge forward with unusual eagerness. The acceleration seemed sharper, more urgent. By the time he lifted off the Norfolk runway, he knew something was different. The aircraft felt alive in a way it hadn't before. At 10,000 feet, Shand leveled off and pushed the throttles to maximum cruise power. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, 410, 415. He checked the gauge twice, certain it was malfunctioning. Standard cruise speed for a Mosquito at this altitude was 400 miles per hour. He was seeing 420. Shand climbed to 20,000 feet. The extra speed remained 25,000 feet, still faster than any Mosquito he'd flown. At 28,000 feet, where the air was thin enough to rob most engines of power, DZ-367 was still indicating 435 miles per hour. That was faster than the Mosquito's rated maximum speed at optimal altitude. When Shand landed and confronted Howe, the flight sergeant admitted everything. The modified fuel mixture, the advanced timing, the increased boost pressure, all of it technically illegal, all of it completely unauthorized, and all of it giving the Mosquito 20 to 30 miles per hour more speed than factory specifications promised. Shand should have grounded Howe immediately, should have reported him to the station commander, should have demanded an investigation. Instead, he asked a single question: "Can you do this to the rest of the squadron?" Howe already had. Every aircraft in 105 Squadron was flying with his modifications, and the results were showing in the mission reports. Crews were outrunning German fighters that had been catching them weeks earlier. The loss rate was dropping. The Mosquitoes were fast again, but word was spreading. Other squadrons wanted to know what Marham was doing differently. The Air Ministry was asking questions, and Rolls-Royce was about to discover that someone was operating their engines in ways they'd specifically forbidden. The modifications themselves were elegantly simple, which made them all the more revolutionary. Howe had realized that Rolls-Royce had built enormous safety margins into their engine specifications. The Merlin was capable of far more power than the technical manuals admitted, but extracting that power required running the engine at settings that reduced its operational lifespan. In peacetime, that trade-off was unacceptable. Engines needed to last for thousands of hours. But in combat, engines didn't need to last thousands of hours. They needed to last long enough to complete missions and bring crews home. If an engine wore out after 500 hours instead of 1,000 hours, but it kept the aircraft fast enough to survive, that was a trade-off worth making. Howe's primary modification involved enriching the fuel mixture at high altitude. The Merlin engine used a 2-speed supercharger to compress air for the engine at high altitude. Standard operating procedure called for a slightly lean fuel mixture to prevent spark plug fouling and reduce fuel consumption, but a richer mixture meant more power. Significantly more power. Howe had calculated that enriching the mixture by roughly 15% would increase power output by nearly 10% at high altitude, with minimal risk of engine damage during the typical 3 to 4 hour Mosquito mission. The additional fuel also helped cool the engine, actually reducing the risk of overheating during sustained high-speed flight. The second modification involved advancing the ignition timing. Factory specifications called for conservative timing that ensured smooth engine operation across all conditions. But advancing the timing meant the fuel-air mixture ignited earlier in the compression stroke, extracting more energy from each explosion. The cost was increased engine stress and higher operating temperatures. The benefit was more power. The third modification was the most controversial. Howe increased the boost pressure, the amount of compressed air forced into the engine by the supercharger, beyond the limits specified in the technical manuals. Rolls-Royce had determined that the Merlin could safely operate at plus 9 pounds of boost under emergency conditions. Howe was running his engines at plus 12 pounds routinely, and at plus 15 pounds when maximum performance was needed. The engineers would have been horrified. That much boost pressure put enormous stress on every component in the engine. Pistons, connecting rods, crankshaft, supercharger bearings. Everything was operating beyond its design limits. In theory, engines should have been failing regularly. In practice, they weren't. Howe had discovered something Rolls-Royce hadn't fully appreciated. The Merlin engine was massively over-engineered. The safety margins built into every component were far larger than necessary. The engine could handle far more stress than its designers admitted, as long as the increased power was used judiciously for combat situations rather than continuous operation. The engines held together beautifully. By late March 1943, every Mosquito crew at Marham was flying faster than they'd ever flown before, and the Germans were noticing. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from March 1943 began mentioning a disturbing development. British Mosquito aircraft were suddenly faster than German fighters could intercept. Focke-Wulf 190 pilots who had been successfully engaging Mosquitoes in February were now reporting that the wooden bombers were pulling away at high altitude. Major Josef Sepp Wurmheller, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader II, one of the most successful German fighter units in the West, filed a combat report on March 21st that captured German frustration. He had intercepted a lone Mosquito at 27,000 feet over the Ruhr. Perfect position, diving from above with speed advantage. His Focke-Wulf 190-5 was one of the fastest fighters in the Luftwaffe inventory, capable of 395 miles per hour at that altitude. The Mosquito accelerated away from him as if he were standing still. Wurmheller, an experienced pilot with 56 victories, had never seen anything like it. He estimated the British aircraft was traveling at least 440 miles per hour in level flight. That speed should have been impossible for a Mosquito at that altitude. German technical intelligence didn't believe the reports initially. The Mosquito's performance specifications were well known. British test data captured earlier in the war showed the aircraft had a maximum speed of 410 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. At 27,000 feet, it should have been significantly slower. Yet pilots were consistently reporting speeds far exceeding known capabilities. By April, the pattern was undeniable. Mosquitoes operating over Germany were untouchable. Even the Luftwaffe's fastest fighters couldn't catch them. The wooden British aircraft were outrunning purpose-built interceptors made of metal and powered by engines specifically designed for high-altitude combat. The Germans tried everything. They sent Messerschmitt Bf-109 Gustavs, their highest-performing fighters, capable of 400 miles per hour at high altitude. The Mosquitoes were faster. They tried Focke-Wulf 190D models, the latest variants with improved high-altitude performance. Still not fast enough. Hauptmann Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with over 200 victories, encountered a Mosquito formation near Hanover on April 12th. He dove on them from 30,000 feet, building enormous speed in the dive, As he closed to firing range, the Mosquitoes simply accelerated. Not dramatically, not obviously. They just pulled smoothly, away, maintaining formation, disappearing into the distance. Phillips' combat report included a note that sent ripples through Luftwaffe command. Either the British have developed a new engine we know nothing about, or they have discovered something about the Merlin we have missed. The Germans had captured Merlin engines. They had tested them extensively. They knew the engine's capabilities intimately. What they couldn't understand was how the British were extracting so much more performance from what appeared to be the same engine. German engineers began examining every captured engine component, looking for modifications. They found nothing, because Eddie Howe's modifications weren't structural. They were operational. The engines themselves were unchanged. Only how they were being run had changed. And that secret wasn't written anywhere the Germans could capture it. By mid-April 1943, someone at Air Ministry had noticed that 105 Squadron at Marham had not lost a single Mosquito to German fighters in 6 weeks. This was remarkable given that other Mosquito squadrons were still taking losses. Questions were asked, reports were filed, and eventually a team of technical inspectors arrived at Marham unannounced. They discovered Eddie Howe's modifications within hours. The fuel mixture gauges on the modified aircraft read differently from standard Mosquitoes. The boost pressure gauges showed higher readings. Most damning, someone had made pencil marks on several instrument panels, indicating non-standard operating procedures. Flight Lieutenant Palmer, the chief engineer who had tried to stop Howe, assumed vindication had arrived. The mad mechanic would finally face consequences. The unauthorized modifications would be reversed. Proper procedures would be restored. What Palmer didn't anticipate was Wing Commander Shand's response. When the Air Ministry inspectors demanded an explanation, Shand provided one. His squadron had not lost an aircraft to German fighters since implementing the modifications. Other squadrons operating standard aircraft continued taking losses. The evidence was irrefutable. Whatever Howe had done, it worked. The inspectors should have shut down the entire operation immediately. Instead, they did something unexpected. They requested a demonstration flight. On April 19th, Wing Commander Shand took one of the Air Ministry inspectors on a high-altitude flight over the North Sea. Standard Mosquito operating procedures, maximum cruise power, everything by the book. The aircraft reached 438 miles per hour at 28,000 feet. The inspector, a veteran test pilot himself, sat in the navigator's seat and said nothing. He'd flown Mosquitoes. He knew what they were supposed to do. This aircraft was doing something else. After landing, the inspector asked to speak with Eddie Howe directly. The conversation lasted 3 hours. Howe explained his modifications in detail. The reasoning behind each change, the testing he'd done, the results he'd observed. The inspector asked technical questions that revealed deep knowledge of Merlin engines. Howe answered everyone. At the end of the conversation, the inspector made a decision that would change the entire Mosquito program. Instead of grounding Howe, he requested permission to extend the modifications to other squadrons, unofficially, quietly, without formal authorization from either the Air Ministry or Rolls-Royce. The reasoning was simple. Mosquito crews were dying because German fighters were catching them. Howe had found a way to make them uncatchable. The modifications violated regulations, but the regulations had been written before anyone knew what combat would actually require. Combat had provided new data. The regulations needed to change, but changing regulations took time. Months of testing, evaluation, committee meetings, formal approvals. Crews didn't have months. They had tonight's mission, and tomorrow's, and the night after that. So the Air Ministry inspector, whose name has never been officially revealed, made a decision. He authorized Wing Commander Shand to continue using the modifications. He recommended that other station commanders be quietly informed that enhanced performance was achievable through careful engine tuning. He suggested that experienced flight sergeants might want to visit Marham to observe maintenance procedures. And he buried the official report where it would take years to find. The file that documented Howe's modifications wasn't classified. It wasn't destroyed. It simply got misfiled in the labyrinth of Air Ministry paperwork, lost among thousands of technical reports that nobody would read unless they knew exactly what they were looking for. By May 1943, flight sergeants from 6 different Mosquito squadrons had visited Marham. Officially, they were there for standard technical conferences. Unofficially, Eddie Howe was teaching them exactly how to make Mosquitoes faster than the Germans could catch. The transformation happened quietly, one squadron at a time, one aircraft at a time. Flight sergeants would return from Marham with careful notes and specific measurements. They would wait until late at night, when most personnel had gone to bed, and they would modify a single aircraft. Just one. A test case. The next morning, an experienced crew would take that aircraft on a mission, and they would notice. At RAF Leuchars in Scotland, Flight Sergeant Tom Bennington spent 3 nights in early May modifying the engines of Mosquito LR-503. The pilot, squadron leader John Whitley, had flown Mosquitoes since they'd entered service. He knew exactly how his aircraft should perform. When he took LR-503 on a photo reconnaissance mission over Norway on May 12th, he reported speeds he'd never achieved before. Bennington modified 3 more aircraft. All showed the same improvement. By the end of May, every Mosquito at Leuchars was flying with Howe's specifications. The squadron's loss rate dropped from 3 aircraft in April to 0 in June. At RAF Whiten in Cambridgeshire, home to 139 Squadron, Flight Sergeant Arthur Price had initially been skeptical. He'd worked on Merlin engines for years. He knew what Rolls-Royce specified. The idea that you could safely run engines at boost pressures that far exceeded factory recommendations seemed absurd. But Price had lost friends. Good men flying good aircraft, shot down because German fighters were faster than anyone had expected. If there was a way to give those crews an advantage, he needed to try it, even if it meant ignoring everything Rolls-Royce had taught him. Price modified his first aircraft in mid-May. The results convinced him. He modified the rest of the squadron. By June 139, Squadron's Mosquitoes were the fastest aircraft over Germany. The crews started taking chances they'd never dared before. Flying in daylight, making multiple passes over targets, coming back for second and third photo runs, all because they knew they could outrun anything the Germans sent after them. The modifications weren't uniform. Each flight sergeant interpreted Howe's methods slightly differently. Some were more conservative with boost pressure. Others pushed even further than Howe had. But the underlying principle remained constant. Extract more power from the Merlin by running it harder than Rolls-Royce recommended. By July 1943, approximately 60% of operational Mosquitoes in Bomber Command were flying with unauthorized engine modifications. The Air Ministry knew, Rolls-Royce suspected, and nobody was saying anything official because the alternative was admitting that factory specifications were inadequate for combat operations. The silence was deliberate. If the modifications were officially acknowledged, they would need to be officially tested. Testing would take months. During those months, aircraft would fly with standard specifications, and crews would die. Better to let the secret spread quietly, unofficially, through the network of flight sergeants who actually kept the aircraft flying. Rolls-Royce eventually learned what was happening through an unusual channel. One of their liaison engineers visiting RAF Marham in August 1943 noticed that the Merlin engines on several Mosquitoes sounded different. Not wrong, precisely, just different. The exhaust note had a harder edge. The supercharger whine was more pronounced. When he investigated, he discovered Howe's modifications. His official report to Rolls-Royce management was carefully worded. The engines were being operated outside recommended parameters. However, no unusual mechanical failures had been observed. Engine longevity might be reduced, but combat effectiveness was clearly enhanced. What the engineer didn't write, but what everyone understood, was that Rolls-Royce had been conservative in their specifications. The Merlin was capable of more than they'd admitted. Combat had proven it. And now the company had a choice. Officially acknowledge the enhanced performance or continue pretending their engines were operating within specifications. Rolls-Royce chose a middle path. They quietly revised their technical specifications for Merlin engines in Mosquito aircraft, increasing the authorized boost pressure from plus 9 pounds to plus 12 pounds. The change was described as reflecting operational experience. No mention was made of Eddie Howe or the dozens of flight sergeants who'd been running engines at plus 12 or higher for months. The revised specifications appeared in September 1943. By then, most Mosquito squadrons had already exceeded them. Autumn 1943 brought a dramatic shift in Mosquito operations. What had begun as a fast reconnaissance aircraft evolved into something far more lethal. With the speed advantage Howe's modifications provided, Mosquito crews started attacking targets that should have been suicidal. On the night of October 3, 1943, 12 Mosquitoes from 139 Squadron bombed Berlin in broad daylight, not dawn or dusk, full daylight at 2 in the afternoon. The target was a radio broadcasting station used for propaganda broadcasts. The approach was at 28,000 feet. German fighters scrambled to intercept. They never got close. The Mosquitoes maintained 440 miles per hour throughout the bombing run. Messerschmitt Bf-109s climbed desperately to intercept, but by the time they reached altitude, the British aircraft were already 40 miles away and accelerating. All 12 Mosquitoes returned safely. Luftwaffe command was baffled. Bombing Berlin in daylight should have been impossible. German fighters should have torn the formation apart. Instead, they'd watched helplessly as wooden British aircraft bombed the capital and flew home without a scratch. 3 days later, 6 Mosquitoes bombed Gestapo headquarters in Oslo at noon, again in full daylight. German fighters arrived 8 minutes after the bombs hit. The Mosquitoes were already over the North Sea, beyond pursuit range. The pattern repeated across occupied Europe. Mosquitoes were striking targets in daylight that heavy bombers could barely reach at night, and they were doing it without fighter escort, without defensive armament, relying entirely on speed. German anti-aircraft commanders reported that the British aircraft were traveling too fast for accurate flak prediction. By the time gunners calculated the correct firing solution, the target had moved beyond effective range. The psychological effect on the Germans was significant. If the British could bomb targets in daylight with impunity, what did that say about German air defenses? The propaganda value was enormous. BBC broadcasts made sure German citizens knew that their capital had been bombed in the middle of the afternoon. But the real revolution was happening at night. Mosquito night intruder squadrons used their enhanced speed to hunt German night fighters. The usual dynamic was reversed. Instead of bombers fleeing from fighters, Mosquitoes were chasing German aircraft. On the night of November 8, 1943, squadron leader Bram of 141 Squadron caught a Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighter approaching a Lancaster bomber stream over the Ruhr. The German crew never knew they were being hunted. Bram's Mosquito, flying with Howe's modifications, accelerated to over 450 miles per hour in a shallow dive. The Messerschmitt, focused on the Lancasters ahead, was flying at roughly 270 miles per hour. The closing speed was almost 200 miles per hour. The German rear gunner spotted Bram's Mosquito 3 seconds before impact. Not enough time to react. Bram's 4 20mm cannons shredded the Messerschmitt in a single burst. The German aircraft exploded so violently that Bram had to pull up sharply to avoid the debris. Over the next 4 months, Mosquito intruder squadrons shot down 83 German night fighters. The hunters had become the hunted. German night fighter crews who had been inflicting terrible losses on British bomber streams now had to watch for British fighters that were faster than anything they flew. The transformation was complete. The Mosquito had evolved from a fast reconnaissance aircraft into the most versatile combat aircraft of the war. It could bomb, it could photograph, it could hunt, and it could do all of it at speeds that made interception nearly impossible. And at the heart of this revolution was a simple set of engine modifications that officially didn't exist. Throughout 1944, German technical intelligence devoted enormous resources to understanding how British Mosquitoes were achieving such extraordinary performance. They captured aircraft, they interrogated prisoners, they analyzed wreckage, they tested engines, and they consistently reached the wrong conclusions. The Germans convinced themselves that the British must have developed a new variant of the Merlin engine, perhaps a new supercharger design, maybe water methanol injection similar to what the Luftwaffe used on some fighters, possibly a completely new engine that just looked like a Merlin from the outside. They never considered the actual answer, that the British were simply running standard engines harder than the manufacturer recommended. This possibility didn't occur to German engineers because it seemed absurd. Engines had specifications for a reason. Exceeding those specifications meant premature failure. Any competent engineering organization would avoid such practices. What the Germans didn't understand was that British maintenance philosophy had changed. Before the war, the RAF had operated like the Luftwaffe. Careful maintenance, conservative operation, engines rebuilt at regular intervals to maximize longevity. But combat had taught different lessons. An engine that lasted 1,000 hours was worthless if the aircraft was shot down after 200 hours. Better to have an engine that produced maximum power for 500 hours and kept the crew alive than an engine that lasted twice as long but couldn't outrun enemy fighters. This philosophical difference extended throughout British operations. German maintenance crews were trained to preserve equipment. British maintenance crews were trained to maximize combat effectiveness. If that meant wearing out equipment faster, so be it. Britain could build more engines. They couldn't replace experienced crews. Eddie Howe embodied this philosophy. He wasn't trying to make engines last longer. He was trying to make crews survive longer. Everything else was negotiable. A captured Luftwaffe intelligence report from May 1944, discovered after the war, revealed German frustration. British Mosquito aircraft continued to demonstrate performance characteristics that exceed all known specifications. Despite examination of multiple captured engines, no mechanical modifications have been identified that explain observed speeds. Conclusion: British have developed new engine variant not yet encountered in captured examples. The report was completely wrong. The engines the Germans were examining were identical to the engines producing extraordinary performance. The difference wasn't in the hardware. It was in how the hardware was operated. And that secret wasn't written on any component the Germans could examine. By mid-1944, even the newest German fighters couldn't catch Mosquitoes reliably. The Focke-Wulf Ta-152, designed specifically for high-altitude interception, had a theoretical top speed of 460 miles per hour at 40,000 feet. In practice, it rarely exceeded 430 miles per hour. Mosquitoes with Howe's modifications were regularly achieving 450 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. The only German aircraft that could reliably catch Mosquitoes were jets. The Messerschmitt Ma-262, with its 540 mile per hour top speed, was fast enough. But Me-262s were rare, reserved for defending against American bomber raids. They weren't wasted chasing individual Mosquitoes. As the war progressed, Mosquito operations became increasingly brazen. They bombed in daylight, often without escort. They flew deep into German territory, sometimes alone, and returned safely. They struck targets that should have been protected by layers of air defense. And they did it all because they were simply too fast to catch. The irony was that German engineers had the capability to do exactly what Eddie Howe had done. They could have run their engines harder, extracted more power, accepted shorter engine life in exchange for better performance. But they never made that choice. German engineering culture valued precision, longevity, and adherence to specifications. The idea of deliberately exceeding design parameters was antithetical to everything they'd been trained to believe. So they kept building fighters to factory specifications, kept operating engines within approved limits, and kept watching British Mosquitoes disappear into the distance. Eddie Howe never received official recognition for his modifications. He was never promoted beyond flight sergeant. He never received a medal. His name appears in no official histories. When the war ended, he returned to Birmingham and resumed working as a civilian mechanic. He died in 1978, largely forgotten. But his impact was profound. By war's end, virtually every Mosquito in RAF service was operating with some version of his modifications. The enhanced performance had become standard. The unofficial tuning methods had been incorporated into official technical orders, though always described as representing operational experience rather than acknowledging their unauthorized origins. Post-war analysis by the Royal Aircraft Establishment concluded that Howe's modifications increased Mosquito effectiveness by approximately 30%. Meaning that for every 10 standard Mosquitoes required to achieve a mission objective, only 7 modified Mosquitoes were needed. In practical terms, this meant fewer aircraft at risk, fewer crews in danger, and significantly lower loss rates. The loss statistics tell the story. In the 6 months before Howe's modifications began spreading through Bomber Command, Mosquito squadrons lost 93 aircraft to all causes, with 41 confirmed as shot down by enemy fighters. In the 6 months after the modifications became widespread, losses dropped to 57 aircraft total, with only 12 confirmed fighter kills. The German fighters hadn't become less effective. The Mosquitoes had simply become too fast to catch. What German pilots had managed occasionally in early 1943 became nearly impossible by late that year. The speed advantage that Howe created turned a fast aircraft into an untouchable one. Wing Commander Shand, who had authorized the continuation of Howe's modifications despite their unofficial status, received the Distinguished Service Order in 1944. The citation mentioned his leadership of successful Mosquito operations, but made no reference to engine modifications. Shand never publicly acknowledged Howe's contribution, though privately he credited the flight sergeant with saving dozens of lives. Several of the flight sergeants who learned Howe's methods and spread them to other squadrons received commendations for maintenance excellence. Again, the official citations avoided mentioning exactly what made their maintenance so excellent. The modifications remained an open secret, widely known within the RAF, but never officially acknowledged. Rolls-Royce eventually incorporated many of Howe's discoveries into their post-war engine designs. The Merlin engines that powered post-war aircraft like the de Havilland Hornet operated at power settings that would have horrified pre-war engineers. The company had learned that their safety margins were larger than necessary, that engines could be pushed harder than specifications suggested. But they learned it from Eddie Howe and the dozens of flight sergeants who'd proved it in combat, not from test cells or engineering calculations, but from actual operational experience, where the cost of being wrong was measured in lives rather than failed test results. By May 8, 1945, when the war in Europe ended, Mosquitoes had flown roughly 40,000 combat sorties. They'd dropped 39,000 tons of bombs, taken hundreds of thousands of reconnaissance photographs, and shot down over 600 enemy aircraft while serving in night fighter roles. More remarkably, they'd done all of this with the lowest loss rate of any British bomber type. Fewer than 4% of Mosquitoes built were lost to enemy action. Compare that to the Lancaster's 13% loss rate or the Halifax 15%. The Mosquito's survivability wasn't just about speed, but speed was the foundation everything else built upon. Eddie Howe's modifications were part of that survivability. Not the only part, but a crucial one. By giving Mosquito crews an extra 20 to 30 miles per hour, he gave them the margin between life and death. A German fighter that could almost catch a standard Mosquito couldn't catch a modified one. That difference mattered. The human cost of this technical achievement is harder to quantify. How many crews survived because their aircraft was too fast to catch? How many missions succeeded because the Mosquito could outrun pursuit? How many German targets were destroyed because Mosquitoes could strike them with impunity? The numbers exist somewhere in the archives, but they tell only part of the story. The real story is about a flight sergeant who looked at an aircraft that everyone said was already fast enough and decided it wasn't, who ignored regulations because regulations were written by people who weren't dodging German fighters over Berlin, who risked his career because he couldn't accept crews dying when he knew a solution existed. That kind of innovation doesn't come from engineering departments or research laboratories. It comes from people on the front lines who see problems directly and refuse to accept that those problems are unsolvable. Eddie Howe saw Mosquito crews dying. He found a way to keep them alive. Everything else was details. The Mosquito's wooden construction has been called its most innovative feature. The use of furniture manufacturers to build combat aircraft was indeed revolutionary, but the speed that made the Mosquito legendary didn't come from de Havilland's design office. It came from Eddie Howe's workshop at RAF Marham, where a stubborn flight sergeant decided that good enough wasn't good enough. The Germans never figured out what the British had done. They kept looking for new engines, new designs, new technologies. They never considered that the answer was simpler and more radical than they imagined. Just run the engines harder, accept shorter engine life, choose combat effectiveness over longevity. That choice, made first by one mechanic and eventually adopted across Bomber Command, changed the course of the air war. It transformed the Mosquito from fast to untouchable. and it saved hundreds of lives that would otherwise have been lost to German fighters that were just fast enough. The Wooden Wonder became legendary for many reasons: its construction, its versatility, its performance. But the speed that made it legendary wasn't in the design specifications. It was in the unauthorized modifications of a flight sergeant who refused to follow the rules when lives were at stake. Eddie Howe returned to Birmingham after the war and never flew again. He never sought recognition, never gave interviews, never told his story publicly. The few people who knew what he'd done gradually forgot or died. By the time historians started asking questions about Mosquito performance, the people who could explain it were gone. But the record remains in maintenance logs, combat reports, and pilot testimonies. The evidence is there for anyone who knows where to look. Mosquitoes got dramatically faster in mid-1943. German fighters that had been catching them stopped catching them. And it all started with one mechanic who decided regulations were less important than results. The story of the Mosquito's speed isn't about brilliant designers or heroic pilots. It's about a stubborn man with oil-stained hands who looked at a perfectly good engine and asked a simple question: what if we ran it harder? The answer to that question kept crews alive, frustrated German fighters, and helped win the air war over Europe. And it all started because Eddie Howe refused to accept that fast was fast enough.